Today, I am an official candidate for the Republican nomination.
Welcome to Perspective 88 with Pat Robertson, candidate for the Republican nomination for the presidency of the United States. And now, your host for Perspective 88, Yolanda Gaskins.
Welcome to Perspective 88 with Pat Robertson. I'm Yolanda Gaskins. Joining you for the next half hour as we discuss the issues facing every American in the 1988 presidential campaign. American voters are faced with a crisis in education. Our public schools are often unsafe for students and for teachers. High school graduates are reading at the 5th grade level, and millions of people can't even read at all. Some say that America's public school system is a failure funded by tax dollars. Now, here to talk about his ideas on education, ladies and gentlemen, Pat Robertson.
Thank you, Yolanda. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on the show now.
We're talking about my favorite subject.
Well, you are the founder of CBN University.
That's right. And it was a great adventure. It's been there for 10 years now, fully accredited graduate, a freestanding graduate university with a master's program in education.
Something else that's been around for about 10 years is the Department of Education. I know that you're not, to say that you're not happy with the success of the department is putting it mildly.
Well, it was set up as a cabinet department as a payoff to the National Educational Association, which is a very powerful teachers union. They were very strong in the election of Jimmy Carter, and at the Democratic Convention in 1980, they comprised about 30% of all the delegates in attendance. So this department was federalizing some of the work that they wanted to do. I think that education should be controlled at the lowest level of our political structure, down in the towns and the counties and the states. And I'm just not at all sure that it wouldn't be a good idea to abolish the Department of Education entirely. Ronald Reagan said he wanted to do that. And so
you obviously have some agreement out there. Let's talk about illiteracy. I touched on that at the very top of the show. The illiteracy rate is soaring. Why is this happening? Why has there been no substantial change in the last, say, 10 or 20 years?
We have spent more money on education, 630% increase, 1962 to 1980. And yet the SAT scores went down every year, and we have 29 million functional illiterates in America. And Yolanda, I've been out to the major cities, the inner cities like Watts and the south side of Chicago and the inner city of Detroit and Philadelphia and Bedford-Stuyvesant and Brooklyn. Half of the inner city kids can't read and write. In New York City, 73% of the students read at or below the 3rd grade level. Which means when they get through the 3rd grade, everything else is gibberish to them. That's why they drop out, so many of them. Why? Because we're not teaching them how to read. They have drugs, they have a serious problem with crime and violence, and there's just no discipline. We need a crime-free, drug-free, disciplined school environment in America as an absolute priority.
Do you think that there has been a real change in the way we're teaching our children in the last few years that's helped contribute to this problem?
Well, there's no question about it. We have moved away from the fundamentals of teaching geography and science and math to what is called the New Age curriculum and the values clarification of secular humanism. And above all else, we have moved away from those moral values that we had when our education was great. And I want to say today, without question, if we're going to get excellence back in education, we've got to start with instilling the moral values of our society in the classroom. We need to bring God back into the public schools of America.
Something else that is finding its way into the public schools is sex education. And there's quite a controversy on when sex education should start, if sex education should start. How do you feel about that?
You know, in America, we have a teenage pregnancy rate that is 7 times that of Sweden, 3 times that of Denmark. These are supposed to be fairly liberal societies. The reason is that in our schools and in our sex education, we are not telling the young people about procreation, about the union of a man and a woman or a boy and a girl brings about the creation of a precious human life. We teach them what I call plumbing in positions. We teach them all kinds of jargon about technical things, but we don't teach them the ethical values, and we don't teach them what we should be teaching them, that we should have continence outside of marriage and we should have fidelity within marriage, and those virtues, which are so very important, are just not being conveyed. So it isn't a question of when they teach sex or where they teach sex, but what they teach about sex that I'm concerned about.
So they're not really teaching about relationships.
Well, that's it. They're not teaching about loving and caring. I saw one textbook that says the only thing that's really important is to achieve physical satisfaction, and that all that was necessary, that homosexual relations, heterosexual relations, sex outside of marriage, before marriage, sex outside of marriage, in marriage, any of these relationships were perfectly fine, but the highest good was to achieve physical satisfaction. Well, that's utter nonsense, but the kids are being taught that, and teachers will not tell children today, this is right, this is wrong. That's considered sort of taboo in our open liberal society, that there's something that would be right and wrong, but there are things that are right and there are things that are wrong, and they need to know it.
And if education is put back in the local jurisdictions, yeah, do you think that that's really going to change that?
Well, it'll change a little bit, but we've got to get the courts out of the school system. The courts have overridden local school boards. They have changed school boundaries. They've interrupted the way the teaching takes place. We've had various types of laws dealing with what children can and can't do. And the amazing thing now that certain things that go on in children's lives can't be told to principals, or they can't be told to their parents. A child in a school today, for example, will go and have an abortion and not even tell their parents, but the laws in certain states, like Virginia, says that if that child falls down and scrapes his or her knee, that the principal can't bring medical attention without the parental consent. So for a scraped knee, you have to get the parent, but for an abortion, you can have that very damaging procedure with no parental consent at all.
We're getting mixed messages.
Totally mixed, totally confused as to who's in charge of the children and what rights the school has and the parents have.
Well, we've got lots more questions on education, and we'll be right back right after this. Welcome back to Perspective 88 with Pat Robertson. We've decided to move on into our studio audience and ask some questions. And Pat, our first question is from someone who's a little bit young to vote, but he still has a good question on education. Come here, Barrett. And your question you wanted to ask Mr. Robertson was what?
What will you do about drugs in lower schools?
Good question.
I think that is a tremendous question, but to think that we've even got drugs in a lower school is a shock to all of us. It used to be that was something in the ghetto, then it was in the colleges, and then it was in the high schools. Now it's in the lower schools, and as I said on a previous program, it's actually down in the first grade and even in preschool. I think the time has come for the federal government and the state governments, the local governments, the Drug Enforcement Administration, the FBI, and all of the agencies of the armed forces to shut off the flow of drugs into this country. And then, as I said in a previous program, I believe firmly that if anyone is convicted of selling illegal narcotics to a juvenile, somebody in the lower grades or somebody in high school, but is convicted of a second offense of that kind of crime, that individual should be given a life sentence in prison with no chance for parole. And I think that would stop it as quick as anything.
We've got another question from Bill Kincaid. Bill, what's your question?
Pat, there's been some discussion of a so-called voucher system for people with school-aged children. Do you feel that's a good idea? And also, further, do you think that that would lead to the destruction of public schools or perhaps improving them?
I am for free enterprise, Bill, in the United States of America. I believe that any time we have competition, we'll have a healthy situation, and every time we have monopoly, it tends to breed complacency and arrogance. Now, I believe that a parent should have the privilege of choosing for his or her child the type of education and the quality education desired. Now, a voucher says that that parent is given the value of education in the form of a voucher. And he or she could take that voucher to a parochial school and say, I want my child to get that kind of education, or to an inner city magnet school like Marva Collins has in Chicago and say, I want this kind of education, or to what is called a fundamental school that emphasizes the fundamentals of learning, or I want that kind of education, possibly to a vocational school in the public school system, or to one of the various public schools that's convenient. But what will happen is those schools that have drugs, have discipline problems, are not delivering quality education, those schools will go out of business, and well, they should. And the schools that are delivering quality education in a crime-free, drug-free, disciplined school environment where the children truly are learning and they don't have to fear for their life when they go to school, that child and those schools will prosper, and we will have education in America vastly better. So I favor starting with the poor people that are helped by government programs, so long as vouchers can't be used either to interject the government into religious schools or to discriminate for any reason on account of race or creed or color or anything like that. As long as we're not in any way discriminating, and then I would like the voucher system to spread to the states, which of course is a totally state matter.
How do you think, Pat, how do you think the issue of busing people out of the city to those different schools would be affected if a voucher program was used?
Well, if there's a voucher used, then I think somebody would have the right to go where they wanted to. It would open up some of the ghetto areas. If the parents wanted quality education, and they do very much, they would then have the means available to them to choose the school that they wanted. Now, I've found that among black people as well as white people, the overwhelming majority do not like the idea of busing their children beyond a certain radius. I mean, they don't object so much to several miles, but to take their children for 5 or 10 miles away from their neighborhood, they don't like it. But for those who say, I want to go into a better school system, this would give them the chance to do so. And I think it would really open up opportunities rather than close them.
We have another question from the audience. Sir, your name?
Gary Crane.
And your question?
My question, Pat, is that as a grandfather of 8, I'm concerned about sex education in the school, and some that have opposed this publicly have been sued. Grandparents and parents have been sued. How would you address this?
Oh, that's interesting.
There's a strange philosophy emerging in the school systems that there's sort of a teacher-child relationship that takes on the nature of an attorney-client relationship, and that they have secrets that are to be kept from parents. In the Mobile, Alabama textbook case, I learned from one of the teachers of a textbook being used in that school system which gave teachers advice as to how to counsel a girl who became pregnant out of wedlock. Question, I am pregnant out of wedlock. What do I do? Answer, call an 800 number in Atlanta, Georgia. This was either an abortion clinic or it was some counseling referral service, but there was nothing about tell your parents, tell your pastor, tell your local physician. And it was an absolute outrage that the parental role was being bypassed by teachers. And more this is coming to pass where the Attorney General, by the way, of the state of Texas said the state owns your children. Ladies and gentlemen, my wife and I have 4 children, and we have 4 grandchildren, and God Almighty owns our children, and He's given them to us as stewards, and they do not belong to Texas, Virginia, or any other state.
We'll be back with more of Pat Robertson and Perspective 88 right after this message. Welcome back to Perspective 88 with Pat Robertson. We've had lots of questions from the audience, and this gentleman also has a question. Sir?
Yes, I'd like to ask Pat how we could restore values in our school system, such as moral and Christian values, that the children might know right from wrong, and as they grow older, they might obey our laws.
Now, back to that Mobile situation, there was a lawsuit brought to indicate 2 things that had happened, and the lower court judge, the district court judge, ruled in favor of a coalition of parents, of teachers, and school children. He ruled, number 1, that a religion of secular humanism, which essentially is atheism, was being taught in the schools through those textbooks, and that number 2, there had been a systematic attempt to delete the religious aspects of our history from the textbooks. Now, the judge was right on both counts. He was overruled by a circuit court that was very caustic in even hearing oral arguments, and they erred. But sooner or later, we must do something about the interference of the courts into our school systems. 82% of the people in America want prayer in the schools. They want moral education because they know it is critical to balanced education. But a small elite of judges and lawyers, primarily from the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, has gone into court to force a tortured interpretation of the First Amendment. I've heard a quote attributed to Senator Daniel Moynihan of New York, who said that the Supreme Court interpretation of the Establishment of Religion clause of our Constitution is, quote, an intellectual scandal. There's no doubt that it is. What we've got to do, first of all, is to put on the Supreme Court, on the circuit courts and in the district courts of America, men and women as judges who believe that the role of a judge is to interpret the Constitution as it was written by the framers and in the context of any amendments, and who do not feel that the role of a judge is to supplant the legislatures and rewrite the Constitution and the law of the land.
We've had lots of good questions from our audience, but we also have some questions from people out on the street, so we took our cameras right outside.
What can you personally do to ensure that these children have a better education than I had and than the children had that I teach?
Well, the first thing I would do in education is to make sure that we restored what is called a broad-based phonics method of reading instead of the current look-say method that has failed so much. The reason we're having so many illiterates in the United States is because we're not teaching reading the way a human being should learn it. I have seen developed through our university, CBN University, and I personally was in charge of an organization called Operation Heads Up that in the last 3 years has trained 123,000 Americans how to read and write without taking one nickel of federal money. Now, I can guarantee for any child with an IQ of at least 80 or 90, literacy skills in 36 lessons, and using volunteers, it won't cost but $8 to do it. Now, compare that with some of the failed programs of education in the schools today. They're just not teaching properly, and that's how I could guarantee at least a basis of reading. But as president, remember, the government doesn't do so much at the federal level. It has to be mostly through the state and local governments and communities.
Pat, I was just wondering, where did we go so wrong? How did the educational system, and if you can just explain this quickly to us, get so turned around?
We adopted the philosophy of a man named John Dewey, who did not want to teach facts to children. He believed in what's called cultural relativism. He believed in humanism. He was a thoroughgoing atheist, and he did everything in his power to move our religious roots, our Judeo-Christian heritage, away from education and to supplant it with what is called humanism, and at the same time to take us away from teaching the facts, the pure facts of geography and history, etc., to the children, and he began to introduce what was called the life-centered curriculum. And in the process, he and his disciples have destroyed American education, and it's time for the people of America to get their schools back.
We've still got lots more ahead with Perspective 88 with Pat Robertson. We'll be right back after this. This is Perspective 88, and we're talking to Pat Robertson. We've been talking about education in this country, and practically, what are some of the things we can do? I know that there are so many ramifications with illiteracy, worldwide ramifications.
Well, you know what this is going to mean? We won't be able to compete. You know, some of our students took a math test up against other nations. We scored just a little bit above Swaziland in math skills. And if we continue, we won't have the literacy of one of the average banana republic. It's a very serious thing. We cannot compete against Japan, against Germany, against Korea, against Taiwan, against all these nations if our kids can't read and write.
Are we creating an elitist group of people? There'll only be a few people in this country who will be able to communicate like that?
Well, I'm
leaving
afraid
most of us out of it?
the people who don't go to private schools and who go to public education. I did a TV show from the University of Maryland. At least our crew went into the University of Maryland, interviewed some students, and we said, could you tell us what nations America fought in World War II? And this one young man, he's either a sophomore or freshman over there, he said, yes, we fought Korea, we fought Pearl Harbor, and we fought the Spanish in World War II. Another one, we said, could you tell us what presidents were in America between John F. Kennedy and Ronald Reagan? And she said, let's see now, there was Truman and there was Hayes. No, he's old, isn't he? And we asked another, said, what 3 states border on California? And this young lady said, well, I used to live out that way. He said, it's Washington and New Mexico. These are students in college. They have, as a matter of fact, I saw the other day that 20-some% of some American high school students could not identify the United States location on a map. It's that bad. I mean, we are destroying our education.
They are just not interested in learning, or just the methods?
The methods, we're not teaching it. Those textbooks are boring, they're not challenging, and they don't have the facts. And they have been doctored to bring out all of this sociological, psychological garbage, but they're not teaching them where America is, who our presidents were, what the square root of 144 is, you know, the multiplication tables, and we sure aren't teaching them how to read and write. It's just very simple. It's not being done.
So you want to get back in there and work on basic education.
Basics with moral values, and throw out this so-called values clarification, this new age curriculum, the so-called progressive education, which is just getting progressively worse.
Well, good luck in your campaign.
Thank you.
I've learned a lot about education today, and the problems that we had. I certainly didn't realize that they were that serious. And I think
they're very bad. But we can change it like that. It's the kind of thing that could be switched around in a couple of years. The American children haven't changed. They're as fine as always. You know, they're not culturally deprived in a sense. The schools are in trouble, not our children.
All right. Well, we hope you can help us find what we're missing.
It's been good being with you today.
Thank you for joining us. We appreciate having you and all the information. Thank you.
We hope you've enjoyed tonight's program. If you'd like more information for yourself or to share with a friend, we've put together a free cassette called What I Will Do as President by Pat Robertson. You'll hear more ideas on topics that concern you, your family, our country, and the world. Please call your local Robertson for President headquarters at the number on your screen and ask for the free audio cassette of What I Will Do as President. And thank you again for listening.